up here really quick and do a prayer. And then I'll go back and transition. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the prayer tonight. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we come to you with gratitude for today. Come to gratitude with gratitude for all the gifts that you provide, the world around us, friends and family, all the things that point us towards you and give us evidence of your love in our lives. We ask you to be with us tonight as we learn a little bit more about you, to bless Amy as she presents to us and shares some of her knowledge and belief. We ask you to be with us and send your Spirit to touch our hearts. And we pray together, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, without further ado, Amy has, I think, a phenomenal topic. I'm very jealous because I have to go next door for a meeting. So you'll have to tell me all about it. Actually, I'm going to be in the meeting. I'm going to be watching this on Facebook, like the rest of you on the other screen. So, Evidence of God. But let me throw up the screen really quick.
Okay, great. All right, ready? Okay. Hello. I think just about everybody knows me and has either heard one of my talks or maybe watched them on. I know we've got a couple people that are logging in through the live stream, so that's kind of exciting. This is a topic I asked Michael if I could give because in all the years that I was teaching middle school, this is always where I had to start. Because middle school, if you've been around that age group, they're really starting to want to form their faith for themselves. And I feel like you have to start with some logical, why should you believe in God? That doesn't necessarily because I said you should, or because the church says you should, or because it's true, which to a middle schooler is absolutely going to bring back, well, how do you know it's true, or why should I believe that, because they're naturally inclined to go against the grain, right? And we find that even in our own lives as adults, it's almost a guarantee that you're going to have a friend, a classmate, a family member, or coworker who is going to believe one of the following things, right? So God does not exist. You're going to have people who are just flat out, God does not exist. They might not even want to enter a conversation with you about it. They're convinced. You can't know if God exists. There's no way to know because God is just this out there, I can't touch it, I can't see it, I can't smell it, I can't feel it, so therefore I can't test it scientifically, and so therefore God can't exist. Or we can't know if he exists. Believing in God is for the simple-minded. This one is, I always think is kind of interesting because there's this idea that, well, you just believe with blind faith. You just believe whatever you're told. You don't really think about this. It's just what your parents told you to believe, or that's just what the church tells you to believe, or whatever. You're simple-minded. You never put any thought into it. You're not looking at it from a scientific or reasonable standpoint. This is my favorite one. You can't believe in both science and religion. So when I taught middle school, I taught science and religion at the same time. And the number of people in my daily life who would just be like, wait a minute, how does that work? Science and religion, because we've been led to believe that they completely contradict each other, which I don't know how it is in other religions, because I was born and raised Catholic, but in the Catholic faith, there could be absolutely nothing farther from the truth. Science and religion go together. And most believers in God are hypocrites. Well, that's for a completely different talk, but you can see where people might believe that. If the people that you see around you that say they believe in God don't live like they say the God who they believe in would want them to live, you could see where people might think that was hypocritical. But that's not our main focus today. What we're going to be looking at is how can we think about God in a way completely removed from certain things. So I'm going to have a couple of Catechism of the Catholic Church quotes in here. And this one in particular, this is the one we're going to start out with. Created in God's image and called to know and love him, the person who seeks God discovers certain ways of coming to know him. These are also called proofs for the existence of God, not in the same sense as proofs of natural sciences, but rather in the sense of converging and convincing arguments, which allow us to attain certainty about the truth. In defending the ability of human reason to know God, the church is expressing her confidence in the possibility of speaking about him to all men and women, and therefore having a dialogue with other religions, with philosophy and science, as well as with unbelievers and atheists. So that's from the Catechism. Our Catechism says, have at it. Having a reasonable discussion about God, that is a way to bring people in, because we all know that we have reason as part of our humanness. All right, so in this presentation, I'm going to have to really work at this because this goes against my nature, but I think I can do this. You won't see or hear in this presentation religion, the Bible, Jesus, the church, and I did put a little disclaimer there because I do have I made it really small so you couldn't read it, but all it says is there may be a couple of references to the Catechism, not as a proof, but more as just a connection, but not as a proof. I'm not saying believe what the Catechism says as a reason for God. And then we're also not going to talk about scripture-based creation stories. So none of these things are going to be used in our discussion about evidence for God. All right, so we're going to use a syllogism. A syllogism is a type of logic, okay? So for example, reptiles do not have fur. We would probably all agree that that's true. I looked it up, it's true. A snake is a reptile, therefore a snake does not have fur. Okay, so we know the first two are true, so therefore we can take the third as true. Now, I'm going to give a disclaimer. Some of the things that we're going to talk about, if you try really, really hard, you could probably convince yourself by some twisting of a logic or some looking at logic in a different way that one or more of them might be a little bit harder to follow. That's fine. I'm not saying any one of these is completely the end-all be-all. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a lot of different things to think about. That's what the goal is here. All right, so this first one is called the first cause argument. Right? This is a very typical argument that is given for evidence for God. It goes like this. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe had a cause, and we call that cause God. That's what we call that cause God. So think about like your dominoes, okay? So let's break this down. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. So let's think about things in this sense as either events or objects, things. So let's think about events. An event having a beginning has a cause. It's that first push. For something to happen, there has to be something that makes that thing happen. Okay? You just don't expect a tree to fall over in the middle of the woods. It's either blown down or the soil eroded or something like that. In fact, we even have some very much agreed on laws of physics that say this. An object at rest will stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force, right? So that ball is going to sit there. It's not just going to start rolling unless there's some sort of energy added to it, which brings us to our next point. Energy is not created or destroyed. So there's everything is affected by something else. If it has a beginning, something caused it. Something made that event happen. Same thing is true with things. We don't expect, as you're walking down the street, that all of a sudden a dinosaur is just going to appear in front of you. Well, why not? If the universe could just poof into existence, why wouldn't we be expecting to see things poofing into existence all over the place? Well, because that's not the way things work. Everything that has a beginning, something caused it, right? A thing doesn't just appear. It came from something. There was something preceding that thing. You ever heard which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, even with the chicken and the egg, something came before that, right? Where did the chicken come from or the egg? Depending on which side you choose, there's still something that came before that. Even if you believe it wasn't a chicken, it was a creature that was sort of like a chicken, but not exactly a chicken or whatever, that still is what produced the egg, that produced the thing we call the chicken. So anything that has a beginning has a cause. Okay, so the universe had a beginning. This is the second part of our syllogism. This one is interesting because it actually, we get this from science, right? In the Big Bang, which is still considered a theory, the Big Bang theory, it's a pretty solid one. There's other theories about how the universe began. But George Lemaitre was the person who is given some credit for this, and I'm not allowed to say it, but I think you can maybe see something about him that might give you some indication of, that I just thought was interesting. But the Big Bang doesn't disprove God, okay? So we can believe in the Big Bang as long as, but what we attribute is that God was the Big Banger. God gave that push, right? That event could have been the beginning, but something had to cause that beginning. So that's the next part, right? Therefore, the universe had a cause, and we call it beginning. God started it all, okay? All right, so then this is the question that we always got in the middle school. Wait a minute, then who created God? Right? That's always the next thought, right? Well, if everything that had a beginning had a cause, well, okay, but we said everything that had a beginning had a cause. So what we need to do then is look at what is the definition of God. Well, Merriam-Webster says it's a being or object that is worshipped as having more than natural attributes and powers. So God, whatever higher power, however word, I'm not even claiming at this point the Christian version of God or the Jewish version of God. I'm just saying God, as a definition, is outside of space, okay? Not bound to be in any one particular place at any one particular time. Not bound to have to be bound by something surrounding him or anything like that. And also outside of time. So God, by definition, didn't have a start. That's what makes God God, is that God didn't have a start. So by the syllogism we were saying, if you remember what I said, is anything that has a beginning has a cause. God, by definition, did not have a beginning. If God had a beginning and had a cause, then there would be something greater than God. And God, by definition, doesn't have anything greater. All right, so the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is just another quote I wanted to throw in here that kind of goes along with this. Let me see if I can get on my screen here so I can read it better. The questions about the origins of the world and of man has been the object of many scientific studies, which have splendidly enriched our knowledge of the age and dimensions of the cosmos, the development of life forms, and the appearance of man. These discoveries invite us to an even greater admiration for the greatness of the Creator, prompting us to give him thanks for all his works and for the understanding and wisdom he gives to scholars and researchers. So we're not saying that scientifically exploring the beginnings of the universe or scientifically asking how did we get here or what was the process that got us here, that doesn't take anything away from God. If anything, we'll see in the next piece of evidence, it enhances our understanding of God. It makes us understand his greatness even more. All right, so this next one is the argument from design. Okay, argument from design. And the argument from design goes like this. The more complex something is, the more likely it is a product of design and not chance. The universe and many things within it are infinitely more complex than all man-made designs. Therefore, the universe is a product of design and not chance. And then the designer of the universe in our mind is God. All right, so complexity, design, something that is so amazingly crazy in its complexity that we can't even imagine how something like that could happen by chance. Okay, so let's look at some of these possibilities. There are over 20,000 different species of bees that help pollinate all kinds of crops. And we rely on these bees for pretty much every kind of vegetable or food that we eat in that sense. So that's a pretty complex thought if you think about it, because 20,000 different species, and we need them. We as humans are connected to those bees. It doesn't even seem like there should need to be that kind of a connection, but there is. That's one of those complex designs. All right, over 50,000 different species of plankton, okay? Plankton are these little wee beasties that live in the water. 50,000 different species produce over half the world's oxygen. Without them, life would cease to exist. So when I was teaching, we would look at plankton under the microscope, and kids just loved it because you couldn't see them in the water, but you look under the microscope and they're swimming around, and it's hard to believe that those little bitty things would be that important to us. They have that much of an effect on us. 50% of the Earth's oxygen. That's pretty complicated. Okay, the Goldilocks principle. So now we're going to look at the Earth as a whole. The Goldilocks principle. You guys have all heard the story of Goldilocks, right? She goes in, one bowl of porridge is too hot, one bowl is too cold, one's just right. One chair's too hard, one chair's too soft, one chair's just right. So there are several components of the way that our planet was made that are so complicated and intricate in how they were put together. They call it the Goldilocks principle because it would not work if it was even a little bit too much one way or a little bit too much the other way. So for example, our atmosphere. Venus's atmosphere is so hot and heavy it couldn't possibly sustain life, okay? Venus is on one side of us, close to the sun, and the atmosphere of Mars is too thin and rigid, okay? So just our atmosphere alone, if it wasn't exactly right, we wouldn't be able to be here. Just the tilt of the Earth, we have this wobble, right? About 22 degrees we tilt. If we were tilted a little bit more to the sun, we wouldn't have the seasons and the climate that we do. If we were tilted a little bit farther away, on a different angle, we couldn't be completely straight upright. All of those little bitty details make a huge difference on whether we're able to have life on the planet. The chemical elements that we need to have in place for life are amazingly complex. We take for granted, if you ever watched a science fiction show, you take for granted when they talk about, carbon-based life forms. But it's true, if we didn't have carbon, it would affect our DNA, it would affect carbon dioxide, which affects the plants, which affects the oxygen, which, all of that is connected, right? What about oxygen? Okay, plain old ordinary oxygen that we take for granted. Then, of course, you've got hydrogen, and hydrogen and oxygen produce water. Now, if you've never heard about the complexities of water as a molecule, it's really pretty amazing because most things, when they freeze, they get solid and they get more dense and they would sink. Okay, so if you had something in it and it froze, it's more likely to sink. Water doesn't do that. That's a good thing, right? Because if you're in a pond and you've got all this wildlife in a pond and the water at the top freezes and it all sank, it would kill everything underneath of it, right? Water is an amazingly strange thing. And of course, it's essential to life. It's essential to life. It's so essential that when scientists look for life on other planets, they look for water because they think if we have water, then there's a good chance we have life like what we know. Okay, so another way of looking at design is that chance element. So if you had a box of Legos and you started shaking it, would you expect to find something like the Millennium Falcon coming out of that, even with all like the little cute little figures? No, you wouldn't expect that just out of chance, just by shaking that box, you're gonna get something so designed, okay, with different intricacies to it that allow us to be able to marvel that, wow, there was some thought put into that. There was some planning. There was an intelligence that made that arrangement in that certain way. Beauty and complexity. So if you saw a Spider-Man watch, that was a Spider-Man smartwatch laying on the ground, or if you were in an art museum and you saw something like the image of the Last Supper, you wouldn't just think, wow, I bet somebody was just walking along and there on the ground was this painting. It just poofed into air and look at how intricate and wonderful it is. No, if you see something like this, you automatically assume that there was some sort of intelligent creator behind that, some sort of designer, someone or something that had some sort of input into its beauty and its intricacy and its ability to perform whatever task it was performing. All right, so then we get to the E word. Okay, the E word. This is the one that scares people off when you start talking about science and religion. So the E word is evolution. Okay, evolution. I get so frustrated whenever I hear on the radio when they talk about evolution versus intelligent design, okay? All right, so evolution, let's talk about evolution a little bit. Does it really matter? Okay, evolution is still a theory. It's a pretty darn good theory. There's an awful lot to support evolution, but technically it's still a theory. Does it matter to whether we believe in God or not? No. It's in a completely different lane, potentially, because I can believe in evolution and I can still believe in God, or I cannot believe in evolution and I can still believe in God. It doesn't affect any evidence for God one way or the other necessarily. It is still a theory, and it begs the question, could God have created everything using evolution? Sure, why not? Why not? I like to think of God as, I like to think of God as looking down on us as you might look down on a toddler who's got one of those boxes with the different shapes in it, the different holes for the different shapes, and they have to try to fit the circle into the right, section, and then they turn it, and then they get the little cube, and they gotta fit it into the right one. I believe God puts those things out there for scientists to find, and it doesn't disprove God. If anything, it proves more that God is out there. But evolution and intelligent design are not incompatible. An intelligent designer could create evolution, and that could be the way that things move along. There's no, in fact, the church has actually come out and said, because evolution doesn't have the church only speaks infallibly on matters of faith and morals, right? And evolution doesn't have a faith or moral component to it. We'll talk a little bit briefly about science in general with that, but evolution doesn't. So if you like the theory of evolution, you're more than happy to believe that. This was a key component when I was teaching to the middle schoolers, and when you think about how 12 and 13-year-olds, where do they get their information? They usually get it from adults or television or whatever, and it showed me just how deeply ingrained that idea of science and faith being in contrast to each other is. It's just accepted as a belief, even though it's really couldn't be farther from the truth as far as what we have. So, okay. So again, a quote from the Catechism to kind of go along with what we're talking about here. It's not only a question of knowing when and how the universe arose physically or when man appeared, but rather of discovering the meaning of such an origin. Is the universe governed by chance, blind fate, anonymous necessity, or by a transcendent, intelligent, and good being called God? Okay, so God, the belief in God is about why we were created, or for what purpose we were created. How things happened is kind of still up for grabs. The how God did it doesn't really matter. When I was teaching science and religion, I would tell the kids, God did it, and that's the important thing that we need to know. How he did it, or when he did it, or in what things he used to do it. Those things are still can still be discovered as long as we believe he did it. All right. I'm going a lot faster tonight than I thought, so maybe you guys will have some questions for me. I don't know. All right, there's two other arguments that I wanted to touch on. I don't feel that they're as strong. They don't have quite as much oomph behind them, but I wanted to kind of explain them to you just because I think sometimes it gives us some good food for thought. So the first one is argument from desire. So the argument from desire goes like this. Everything that you desire has a thing or something that will satisfy that desire. Okay, so if you're hungry, there's food. If you desire sleep, or if you're tired, you desire sleep. You can sleep, right? And if you break that down into our innate desire for relationship, or our innate desire seeking, why are we here? Where did we come from? What is our purpose? Again, this one maybe isn't as strong because people could argue, well, I don't care about those things. But I think if we're being honest with ourselves, most of us wonder at some point, like, what is the point of us being here? Why are we even here if we're just going to poof into the air at the end, right? And then the second one is an argument for morality. And again, this one, when I taught this several years ago, it made a lot more sense. I feel like the lines of morality, this isn't as strong of an argument now because people are taking morality and kind of changing it to fit their own beliefs that it is. But I think in general, people are being honest with themselves, they will acknowledge that there are some things that are good and there are some things that are evil. And across generations and centuries and millennia, people have pretty well agreed that there are some things that are good and some things that are evil. Morality doesn't apply in nature though, right? We don't, if an animal kills another animal, we don't consider that a moral decision on their part. They're removed from that morality. So the argument for morality says that we as people have a different level of understanding because we can understand things being good or bad, as opposed to an animal who really only reacts because of punishment or something like that. Even my dog, although my dog would tell you that getting into the trash is really bad and looks very guilty when he does it, but he's really just trying to avoid punishment. And we can't change morality, okay? So we can't change morality. We can't go back in time and say, well, you know, now I want what Hitler did to be good and what Jesus did to be bad. You might hear some people have some false arguments, but it's not going to be universally accepted that those things, it's not something that we can change. So it doesn't apply to nature, and it doesn't resound from us because we can't change it. If it was a law that was made by humans, human beings could change it. So that is the next step to that then could be that, well, because there's something that transcends that. There's something that transcends nature, there's something that transcends us, and that's where the dictates of what's good and bad are how they're decided. So like I said, these are a little bit, there's some other ones, there's actually one that's just specifically about the brain, which kind of goes along with the complexity, but if you start looking into how complex the brain is, or even the parts of the human body, it's really amazing. In fact, some I guess even philosophers or scientists or theologians have argued that it actually takes more faith to not believe in God often than it does to actually believe in God. I mean, when you hear the intricate ways that people try to twist around the acrobats, if you will, that they try to do in order to say, no, I don't believe in God, and even if you offer them a proof like this, you kind of raise your eyebrows at it sometimes. All right, so getting beyond these evidence for God that we have. Let's say you're talking to somebody who is they're at this point where you're really not getting through to them, or they're like, well, maybe I could kind of see that kind of makes sense to me. We come to something called Pascal's wager, okay? And Pascal's wager basically comes down to playing the odds, okay? So somebody who says, I don't think God exists, this can be a way to, it's not an evidence per se, it's just something to give them for food for thought, okay? So here's the way this works. We've got two sections that we're looking at. God is real, God is not real. I believe in God, I don't believe in God. And so there's going to be some combinations that we could come up with here. So let's say that I believe in God, but God is not real. What's going to happen at the end? Poof, God's not real, we're all just going to dissolve into dust and nothing's going to happen, right? What if God is not real and I don't believe? Same thing, right? If God's not real, poof, nothing changes, nothing happens. What if I believe in God and God is real? Okay, well, I believe in God, God is real. Usually a belief in God involves some sort of, there's an afterlife or some sort of extension. If you believe that God is real, you believe that you're going to be able to join into that afterlife or join into that extension or be reincarnated or whatever. Like I said, right now we're not saying one particular religion is correct, but believing in God, usually that would be the next component. If you don't believe in God and God is real, well, God isn't going, if you don't want to be with me, I'm not going to force you to be with me. That's a pretty human thing. I'm not going to force it. If you don't want to be around me, I'm not going to, if I force you to, we're both going to be miserable. And the same can be said for God. If you don't believe in God and God is real, He's not going to force you to be with Him. So in some contexts, that would mean you would end up in a life away from God. All right, so these three nothing happens. Notice that these two, if God is real, if I believe in God, either nothing's going to happen because God isn't real, poof. Or if I believe in God and God is real, then I'm going to be able to be with him later. So you're playing the odds. You're saying, well, okay, so if God is real, what's it going to hurt if I believe in him? What's it going to hurt? What is the negative aspect of believing in God? If he's not real, poof. Right? When I was in college, actually just before I started college, I was at the orientation for freshman year, and I was sitting down with this other freshman. We talked late into the night, and he said, it's not fair. He was an atheist at the time, and he said, because if you're right, you're going to end up in heaven, and I'm going to end up in hell, and that's just not fair. And he says, if I'm right, then we're just both going to go poof, and I'm not going to be able to say I told you so. Well, I don't know what to tell you, dude, right? He did end up actually converting, became a very strong Christian, later on in years. But we spent almost the whole night just talking about this as an 18-year-old. So, all right. So, an important note. The church does not say that all atheists or agnostics will go to hell. The church does not say that. The church also does not say that all believers will go to heaven. You read the Bible, it says even the demons believe, right? So just straight belief in God is not going to be the thing that's going to get you into heaven, right? It's how you live your life, how you do with that belief, how that changes you. Okay. All right, so this is one of my favorite quotes. I had this in a poster in my room, and I tried to give you guys the cliff notes so it'd be a little bit easier for you to see, but I'm going to read you the whole thing, okay? This is from the Catechism. This is paragraph 159. Faith in science. Though faith is above reason, there can never be any real discrepancy between faith and science, since the same God who reveals mysteries and infuses faith has bestowed the light of reason onto the human mind. God cannot deny himself. Neither can truth ever contradict truth. Consequently, methodical research in all branches of knowledge, provided it's carried out in a truly scientific way, and does not override moral laws, can never conflict with faith. Because the things of the world and the things of the faith derive from the same God. The humble and persevering investigator of the secrets of nature is being led, as it were, by the hand of God in spite of himself. For it is God, the conserver of all things, who made them what they are. But I like to think that God made everything for us to discover, and he made us to have a desire to want to discover those things. That's all I have. I apologize. I only went a half an hour. So now you're going to have to come up with some questions to ask me, or maybe some thoughts or some points. Was there anything that I said that really made you think?
Would you mind backing up to the Legos?
Yeah. Like
Just
that.
bring it back to my level.
The Legos, yeah. My youngest daughter has been so into Legos lately. All right.
Yeah, I think it's funny because the exact point you made about like chance is you never actually think if I put a lid on that and I shake the box, it will become more complex.
Right.
It's like actually something we know from entropy, is that the theory of entropy says that the things in nature tend to actually evolve. They don't tend to evolve. So putting evolution and the idea of like shaking things in chance together. So the typical comment is, oh yeah, there are a couple things, at the beginning, one or two atoms or whatever at the beginning, molecules, whatever it is, and they just happen to combine, hit, poof, explosion, things got more complicated, and here we are. It's like, well, that just doesn't make much sense, because even if you start with all those Legos and you shake it and shake it and shake it, and you check every once in a while, you're not going to get a more complicated thing. What's going to happen is the Legos are going to rub against each other and break each other.
Right.
You're actually going to eventually you'll have dust and a broken box. So really, it's like the idea that things get more complicated implies that there's something guiding the evolution and drawing it upward, because things tend not to go upward. So when you hit that, I was just thinking like, even the idea of like one of those like little like Lego guns getting in one of those guys' hands, that would be amazing. Like, that would be like a Snapchat or a what is everybody using like now? TikTok. That'd be a TikTok thing where you I'm gonna shake this box and the lightsaber ends up in his hands, you do it and everybody goes, that's amazing. Because it just doesn't seem likely or possible.
Well, I always think too, along the lines of evolution, you have the fact that there are connections between, you think of like a veterinarian, right? And a veterinarian has to know how multiple animals work, and there are similarities, right? You know, mammals maybe have a certain, you know, format or whatever, but actually the fact that they're similar in that way also speaks to the complexity, because the fact that things kept going in a certain way and didn't diverge, if at every point things could have gone a trillion different ways, which when we roll it back to the beginning of the universe, there really are a trillion different, you know, a trillion to the trillionth or whatever amount of ways that it could have gone at the beginning. And then the next step, and then the next step. And when you compound those things on top of each other, the chances that each of those would have worked that way, you know, even the fact that our sun is as stable as it is, even the fact that our atmosphere is the way it is, that our core, the core and the inner core and the outer core create a force field that helps protect us, and, you know, and gravity, the fact that we have gravity the way that we do, all of these things on top of each other. Maybe one of those things you could expect to be by chance, but all those things compounded on top of each other is really pretty amazing. And like I said, it almost takes more faith to believe that those things could have happened by chance than that they happened by a divine intelligence. You've probably all heard of like Alcoholics Anonymous. And in Alcoholics Anonymous, the first 3 steps are just believing that we can't control everything, that there's a higher power, there's a possibility of a higher power that could, and that if I let that higher power have some control, that the addiction can be overcome. So even something as agnostic, or, you know, it's not considered a faith-based organization, has helped a bunch of different people, but a big chunk of Alcoholics Anonymous and some of the other those anonymous groups, that is really what the core of the program is that belief in a higher power. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a Christian God, you know, we'll get to that later on. I know Michael has plans for certain different components. I mean, we're gonna go from this to the Eucharist next week, right? Is that next week? Okay, so we'll have a talk on the Eucharist, so talk about going from one to the other. But even in that sense, when we would talk about the Eucharist in classes, we would talk about different things changing state. And, you know, we don't really wonder at the fact that a liquid and a solid and a gas can change state and still be water. You know, we kind of take that for granted. And so even some of the things within Eucharistic miracles and all of that are really not that far outside of the realm of our comprehension. Like I said, one of the best things for my students, if I could just get them to understand that they can be scientists and still be faith-filled. A lot of scientists have a faith-filled background. In fact, Pope Francis has a background in science, and he's spoken out about evolution and basically said, okay, that could be, all right, let's go with it. But it doesn't affect whether I believe in God. It doesn't affect whether Jesus is true. It doesn't affect all of those things. So, and a lot of really important scientific discoveries were discovered by people of faith, because that was where the education was at the time. And so, questions, comments? It is hot in here. Yeah. Maybe it's a good thing I didn't go quite as long. So my understanding is that we're going to be trying to have talks or discussion things. We're going to start getting into having them almost every week. I know we're having the Eucharist next week. So we'll have Eucharist next week, which we were talking beforehand, goes along with the readings that we had last week and this week, and I think the next week we're having those readings from the Gospel of John about the Eucharist. So that's pretty exciting. I know there's going to be one on the Mass, a specific one on the Mass in September. I'm going to give one on the Saints in October, which I'm so looking forward to, because right before All Saints Day, so that'll be a lot of fun. I like to look at the iconography of the saints and how you can tell which saint, you know, like name that statue kind of thing, like what saint is this and how do I know? So that'll be a lot of fun. But we're going to kind of go back and let people who don't know that much about the church, people who are new, people who maybe have been cradle Catholics and they grew up with the church, but they just want to know a little bit more. So we're going to start getting that going on a regular basis. So I hope you guys can join. I think it's really neat that we're able to live stream them, and they're also saved online if you want to go back and watch them again. So, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, is there something to add?
Okay, go for it, go for it.
Well, if you back up again.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember. Keep going back, I guess. I can't remember which slide.
Was
Or,
it
sorry, the other way. I'm sorry.
the way?
Yeah.
So after design.
Yeah, there was a nuance point in there. Keep going. It was like energy can't be created or destroyed was the key phrase.
Let's see.
I think it's still back a little bit
Was it the first one for?
somewhere.
Oh, I know, it was here. It was part of this one, I think.
There it is. Yeah. So event, energy is not created or destroyed. So I actually had somebody argue this with me one time. They're like, well, wait a minute, we know energy is not created or destroyed, so how did it get created like God created it? And so the key thing to understand there is actually that the word created or destroyed, so in that phrase, energy is not created or destroyed, is not being used the way that we use the phrase, the word created when we talk about God creating. And that's not just Catholics like kind of finagling their way around, like using fancy words around the question. It's actually the word created, or in the phrase is not created or destroyed, is actually, there's a nuance in that phrase rather than in the Catholic phrase. The Catholic phrase, when we say God created from nothing, we mean there was literally nothing, and then God, through his own just divine power, brought things into existence. But when we say the phrase not created or destroyed, we're already working within a framework, so the nuances there'd be like an asterisk with that. Within the laws of nature, energy is not created or destroyed. God created the laws of nature, and then within that, energy is not created or destroyed. And so what we would call that creation of that initial creation, it's outside the laws of nature. We have a term for that in the Catholic Church. It's called a miracle. So it's a supernatural occurrence within the natural world, or in this case, the start of the natural world. And then when we talk about like this like the end of the world, when those things cease to exist, we would talk about like, oh, it's not destroyed, so therefore it's going to exist forever. Well, no, that's not true either. It's going to have an end, but that also is a miraculous event, something that's outside of the natural world. So I guess the reason I kind of like highlighted that in the back of my mind was just a good friend of mine that I used to be very close with. She argued that with me. It's like, well, they're created, destroyed, we're using the same words, but but the reality is they have two different meanings. Within the context of the natural world, energy is not created, nor is it destroyed. But when we, as like just intuitively think about it, and then as well as religious people, when we think about God creating or destroying the universe or something like that, we're thinking about the miraculous term of created or destroyed, not the natural form of created or destroyed. I hope that makes sense.
And that makes me think of something that I've told my daughters too about terminology. And I told them, I said, here's the secret to like any college essay you ever have to write. Start out defining terms, or acknowledge the fact that whatever it is that you're explaining, if people have a different opinion on what that term means, you can't get anywhere, because you're looking at completely different sides of the elephant, or whatever you want to say. You're not going to get anywhere if you can't agree, or if you don't at least understand what I mean when I say, or like if you said in the natural. And what's interesting about that is we don't usually think outside of our own natural thing. Try to explain to 13-year-olds the difference between weight and mass. Okay, so we are all on planet Earth. Most of us, unless we're billionaires, are going to remain on planet Earth for a long time. So when we say weight and mass, it's on Earth, those are the same thing. But mass is actually what you're made up of, and weight has to do with gravity. So if you go on the moon, your weight is different, but your mass is the same. But most of us are never going to go to the moon, so we use weight and mass interchangeably. So that just as an example of like how the terms, scientifically, they mean different things, and if you're having a discussion, you need to know which one you're talking about. But in just general context, it doesn't really matter. So. Right. Okay. Well, guys. I'm glad that you came. Sorry I didn't talk longer. I'm geared to about a 30 to 45 minute, my classes were 40 minutes, so I'm geared to about a 40 minute talk. But I'd rather spend 30 minutes and say stuff that's relevant than stretch it onto an hour and just give you guys extra fluff, so. Okay.
I was watching to see if there was any questions or anything on Facebook.
Oh, thank you.
There wasn't anything on
Were there a few people on there? There should have been.
There's 4, I'm probably one of them, so it's probably 3.
Well, that's good. I think I know the 3 people who are on there because I sent them the link right before it came. So.
Cool.
Do you know how to turn that off?
I'll see.
Yeah, I was-